Wednesday. All right, for those of us that are alive and remain, we are working our way through 2 Samuel. And we are in 2 Samuel 17. If you're a guest with us, we're working our way through books of the Bible, which is our norm. And we're getting close to the end. The news is getting better, but there's still some weird stuff that's got to happen. I do want to thank the parents of the teenagers and the teenagers as well that came out for that training last Wednesday. We had a blast. If I don't know if the summer nights are going to be any good, but we had a good time at the training. And also a shout out to those who helped make 2 parades. Probably the most powerful thing we do as far as letting people know in the valley that we exist. Rumor has it there was as many as 10,000 people. It's hard to believe, but there's as many as 10,000 people in the Huntsville parade alone. The Liberty parade was maybe a third of that. There had to be maybe 3,500 people there or so. We had 2 floats. The Liberty parade had 30 people from our church on our church T-shirts, either pounding on a banjo or a guitar or handing out candy and or protecting people from being run over by floats, which we were really good at this year. And it was just awesome. It was awesome. And so thank you for people that were in both parades representing an opportunity for people to know that we exist, because there are still people that don't. And so good on you. 2 Samuel 17, we have prayed. And so I just want to invite you, I hate that thing, to think about whatever's the most heavy thought process in your heart, right? Whatever it happens to be, what's keeping you up at night? What is the thing that you think about the most during the day? A worry comes to mind. Is there one of those? It could be a health issue, a job or money, relationship or disappointment, or it could be a sin issue. Whatever it is, you decide. But what's that one issue that just is heavy on your heart today? That's what we want to talk about today. You see, because the next question about however you answer that question, whatever it is that's heavy on your heart, what's God's part in that circumstance, and what's your part in that circumstance? And there's a tension that's between the idea of a sovereign God whose plan and purpose will be accomplished. And we, as people made in the image of God, part of being an image bearer of God is that we exercise a free will, which just makes theology discussions a ton of fun, doesn't it? But we exercise our will and we make choices, and there are consequences to those choices, both good and otherwise. Somehow, both of those things, God's sovereignty and our free will, make up our story. We have an example of that today here in 2 Samuel 17. If you'll remember, at the end of chapter 16 was when Ahithophel gave counsel, he gave advice, and the Bible describes it as his advice was as if it were hearing the voice of God himself, which opens up the discussion in chapter 17. Verse 1 says this. I'm reading out of NASB today, so just if it's a little different than yours, you'll know why. Furthermore, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Please let me choose 12,000 men that I may arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and exhausted and terrify him, so that all the people who are with him will flee. Then I will strike him down, the king alone, and I will bring back all the people to you. The return of everyone depends on the man you seek. Then all the people will be at peace." So the plan pleased Absalom and all the elders of Israel. Well, that's fun. Ahithophel gives counsel, and it's widely agreed upon by the group of people that need to agree upon it, that it's really good counsel. David is disorganized and weary. It is time to strike. So Ahithophel gives this good counsel, and Absalom and the elders in particular agree. One of the interesting parts of this is that Ahithophel puts himself right in the middle of the action. Ahithophel isn't a soldier. He's not a warrior, right? He's not a commander. We don't even know whether or not he's really a leader. He's just an advice giver. Lord knows our church is filled with those, right? And Every church, by the way, is filled with those. Suddenly, he wants to lead the troops. He wants to immediately chase David down. He wants to be the one who actually kills David. He's very specific. He is the key to this plan. That's a reminder that this is a very personal mission for him. We assume that since the counsel of Ahithophel is like hearing from God himself, that this will be the plan. It's kind of surprising what follows. The next verse. Then Absalom says, now call Hushai the Archite also, and let us hear what he has to say. And Hushai had come to Absalom, and Absalom said to him, Ahithophel has spoken thus. Shall we carry out his plan? If not, you speak. So Hushai, you take your pick, said to Absalom, this time the advice that Ahithophel has given is not good. Moreover, Hushai said, you know your father and his men. They are mighty men, and they are fierce, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. And your father is an expert in warfare and will not spend the night with the people. Behold, he has now hidden himself in one of the caves or in another place. And it will be when he falls on them at first attack that whoever hears it will say, there has been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom. And even the one who is valiant, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will completely lose heart. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. But I counsel that all Israel shall surely be gathered to you, from Dan even to Beersheba, as the sand that is by the sea in abundance, and that you personally go into battle. So we shall come to him in one of the places where he can be found, and we will fall on him as the dew falls on the ground, and of him and all of the men who are with him, and not even one will be left. If he withdraws into a city, then all of Israel shall bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it into the valley until not even one small stone is found there. Then Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had ordained to thwart the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring calamity on Absalom. That is a bizarre chapter or paragraph in the Bible. Given what we know, we're kind of expecting Absalom to go along with Ahithophel's counsel. But for some reason, he wants a second opinion. Reading through what Hushai, whatever his name is, says, there's likely a high level of fear among Absalom and the army. David was a fighting legend. He was the GOAT. And for all of you who don't do sports, ask someone who does what that means, right? Greatest of all time. He was a warrior. David and his men know how to fight. And I don't think either Absalom or the army were excited about the thought of doing battle with David and his mighty men. There does seem to be a little bit of a fear factor there, which I find interesting. Maybe that's why he asked for a second opinion. Hushai, remember, is David's buddy, who's pretending to be with Absalom, right? He understands that the counsel of Ahithophel is very good. And if Absalom does what Ahithophel says, it's likely that David's going to be defeated. So his counsel carries this idea of buying David time to regroup, refresh, make strategy in order to stand a better chance of winning the battle. He says the counsel of Ahithophel is not good this time. Your dad's a warrior. He's mighty. Everybody knows that. Even the imagery in his little speech is interesting. He's going to be like a bear who's lost his cubs in a field. He's just looking for someone to devour, right? He's got nothing to lose. I'd think twice about messing with him right now. See, David is an experienced warrior. He's not going to be sleeping with everyone else. He's going to be off in a cave somewhere. And if his troops pounce on your troops, win the victory, your army's going to lose heart. Even the brave people in your army are going to lose heart. It's going to panic. You better slow down, rethink this, he says. Here's what I would do. I'd bring the people out in mass from north to south. Let's call everybody out, get them all together. And again, that would have taken time, lots of time. It would have given David a considerable amount of time to regroup, strategize, get ready for battle. It says, then we'll come out in mass like the sand to the seashore, and we'll pounce on David, and it'll be like the dew on the ground. We'll just overwhelm him. If he gets into the city, we'll come in mass, we'll pull the city apart and kill everybody, and Absalom will be the winner. The other part of it that I think is interesting in Hushai's counsel is that he plays to the massive ego of this blonde-locked, loving his own hair Absalom, right? You yourself need to come into the battle. You need to be the winning king in this battle. And I'm sure that was appealing to Absalom. The text tells us that Absalom and the men of Israel thought Hushai's advice was better. And the reason I think that's really interesting is that Ahithophel, when he gives his advice, it says Absalom and the elders thought it was good advice. You know what the elders aren't going to do? They're not going to war. They're just making the decision. Yeah, that sounds great. You guys go. You guys go. That's good. Good plan. The elders are not going into battle. When Hushai gives his advice, the text says that Absalom and the men of Israel, that would have referred to the army, right? That's a reference to the army. That they're the ones going to the battle. They're saying, I think Hushai's plan is better. The more soldiers we have, the better I like our chances. But then the text tells us in verse 14 that really Ahithophel's counsel was good. But it was thwarted because God is sovereign. And he had determined that Absalom was not going to be king and that David would win. See, God chose David to be king, and God chose Solomon to follow David as king, not Absalom. So there's a strong and very unusual statement about the sovereignty of God in this whole story. We'll come back to that in a couple minutes. All right, verse 15, you ready? See if we can get down to verse 22. Then Hushai said to Zodak and to Abiathar the priest, this is what Ahithophel counseled Absalom and the elders of Israel, and this is what I have counseled. Now therefore send quickly and tell David, saying, do not spend the night at the fords of the wilderness, but by all means cross over, or else the king and all the people who are with him will be destroyed. You see, Hushai doesn't know whose counsel is going to be followed yet. Okay? Now Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying in Rogel, and the maidservant would go and tell them, and they would go and tell King David, for they could not be seen entering the city. But a lad did see them and told Absalom. So the two of them departed quickly and came to the house of a man in Bahurim who had a well in his courtyard, and they went down into it. And the woman took a covering and spread it over the well's mouth and scattered grain on it so that nothing was known. Then Absalom's servants came to the woman at the house and said, where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? And the woman said to them, they have crossed the brook of the water. And when they searched and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. It came about after they had departed, they came up out of the well and went and told King David. And they said to David, arise and cross over the water quickly, for thus Ahithophel has counseled against you. Then David and all the people who were with him arose, crossed the Jordan, and by dawn not even one remained who had not crossed the Jordan. Hushai goes to the priest and he says, this is Ahithophel's plan, this is my plan. He doesn't know which one's going to be taken, but the plan was that he'd give the word to the priest would tell his kids would go run and tell David. And they're about a mile outside the city, so they wouldn't be seen coming and going. But someone does see him, tells Absalom. Absalom sends troops after the spies, right? They're trying to get to David first, but they come into this town of Bahurim, and they find a family that gives them refuge, hides them, and they put something over top of the well. They throw grain on it. Soldiers get there. Very much like this scene in the Old Testament of Rahab hiding the spies, right? In the early part of Joshua, the language is identical. The spies are hidden, a lie is told, and the soldiers are sent in the wrong direction. When they're gone, the spies come up, they go tell David what's up, encourages them to cross the Jordan River. David does that. They go to the west bank of the Jordan. If Absalom had caught them there, they'd have been trapped against the river and they would have been slaughtered. So overnight, they cross the Jordan, they get on the east side, and now there's this barrier, this natural barrier between David's troops and Absalom's troops, and that's where we sit at verse 23. Now when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and arose and went to his home, to his city, and set his house in order and strangled himself. Thus he died and was buried in the grave of his father. Well, thanks for that verse, right? Just an interesting way that it's recorded in this Hebrew, this poetic, gorgeous, meta narrative. That Ahithophel's plan wasn't taken, so he goes, puts his affairs in order, and kills himself. Just very matter of fact, bang, bada bang, bada bang, and it's over. Now, it is important to understand that Ahithophel did not kill himself because he was throwing a tantrum, a little hissy fit, that his advice was not followed. Ahithophel knew that his advice would have worked. He's pretty sure the Hushai's advice is not going to work. And when David finds out that he had betrayed him, once David wins the battle, he's going to hunt Ahithophel down like a dog and make him pay for his betrayal. And so he just did not want that to happen. He realizes he's on the losing side and he'd be killed as a traitor. So he just does it ahead of time. He makes the decision to take himself out. It raises an interesting question. This is where the text really slows down a little bit for us, right? Why would someone who has such a history of being shrewd, skillful, a wise counselor, as if hearing the voice of God himself, all of a sudden choose to side with Absalom, a decision that would ultimately cost him his own life by his own hand? The answer is because his mind got clouded because he was angry, he was bitter, he was enraged, he was unforgiving. Do you remember who Ahithophel's granddaughter was? Bathsheba. And he stayed counseling David all these years, waiting for his chance to get revenge. And he took that chance. That's why he wanted to be the one to kill David. He wanted to be the one to lead the troops. And it cost him his own life. Whenever someone's driven by anger or bitterness or unforgiveness, a desire for revenge, you do not think clearly. You're almost guaranteed to make bad decisions that have the potential of destroying your life as well as hindering the life of others. That's exactly what happens to Ahithophel, and it cost him his life. Verse 24. Then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. Absalom set Amasa over the army in place of Joab, and now Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Ithra the Israelite, who went into Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. And Israel and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. That's abundantly clear how she would apply that to our lives, isn't it? I think the point is this, okay? It's ultimately saying is now Joab is with David, so the new leader of the troops for Absalom is Joab's cousin Amasa. So this is truly civil war again. We have a son wanting to kill his father. This would be David's nephew. Now who is the head of the troops under Absalom. This is a family war within Israel. Next verse, we're doing well. You guys are doing great. Now when David had come to Mahanaim, Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah, the sons of Amnon, Machir, the son of Amiel, and Lo-debar, the Barzillai. I'm so glad Isaac's not here today. The Gilead from Rogelim brought beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese of the herd for David and for the people who are with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. Well, that's nice. What's the significance? It's interesting to me that the people who are helping David are unlikely sources. The names listed are from the Ammonites, from the Gileadites, while the Hebrew army is pursuing them to kill them. Israel's against David. All the people that David conquered and provided shalom for earlier, they're the ones helping David out. All of this sets the stage for a bloody civil war, and we will get there next week. But for this week, again, I want us to imagine, you just read this at home, the application for everyday life. Yeah, don't be bitter. Don't do the Ahithophel thing. That's an easy one. All right, that one's not hard. But I think there's more to it than that. It's one of those chapters in this part of the Samuel story, and he says, how do I apply that to my life? Right? There's a bunch of details that seem irrelevant, a bunch of weird names that I butchered, and I know that. And it's just one of those, it's one of the reasons people don't read through the Bible every year, because you got to plow through Leviticus and Deuteronomy and 2 Samuel. And yet it's still the reason we should, because there's more there than we think. These narratives are written so beautifully, skillfully. And so now this part of the narrative invites us to go back and see not the part that was God's part, God's sovereignty, but what's David's part in the choices he made, in some cases, long ago. Start in verse 14. Significant statement regarding the sovereignty of God. I already mentioned it. This clear statement where we now know David's going to win, Absalom's going to lose. They don't know that yet, but we do now. Okay? Ultimately, God is in charge and he is sovereign. God chose David, followed by Solomon. He did not choose Absalom, and nothing Absalom can do will change that. We're reminded that Ahithophel's counsel was good, but God thwarted it because God intends for Absalom to lose. And it raises all kinds of questions. It's one of the reasons we don't keep the kids in here, right? Here goes. Do we mean by that everything that's transpired as a part of the 1st and 2nd Samuel story was all what God intended? What he sovereignly intended? Did God want David to commit adultery with Bathsheba? Did God want David to kill Uriah and some of the other mighty men that went to the front wall with him? Did God want Amnon to rape Tamar? Did he want Absalom to kill Amnon? Does God want Absalom to kill David? So what does the sovereignty of God mean? Did God orchestrate all of that? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That is a bad understanding of the sovereignty of God, right? And a lot of people struggle with that to this very day. We won't get off on it because we don't have time. But why is there evil in the world? Because man is evil, right? God gets blamed for a lot of stuff he had nothing to do with. He created a garden that was perfect. Someday he'll get us back to a garden that will be perfect. We're the ones that messed it up in between. It's a bad understanding of the sovereignty of God. There's this tension between God's sovereignty, his plan and purpose, and we're made in God's image, so we have free will. We can choose. And those desires and choices affect the story. Somehow there's God's sovereignty and there's my choices. And it's nearly humanly impossible to reconcile those two things. It's one of the paradoxes of the Christian life that we just have to get over, at least this side of heaven. It's not unusual for me to have people sit in my office, usually they're married and aren't sure they still want to be, and they'll say, why would God do this to me? And I have to love them enough to say, oh, God did not do this to you. God let you do this to you. These are as a result of your decisions. When I say stuff like that, my counseling calendar has gone way down. But I have to remind them, God didn't do this to you. You did this to you by the choices you made. You're the one that made these choices, and you're now trying to recover or deal with the consequences of your choices. God's sovereignty doesn't mean that that's what God intended. Your choices help define the pathway of our life, and somehow in the context of that, God accomplishes his sovereign will. That's what's so amazing. David fully understood this. Remember when David was escaping from Jerusalem and beginning to head up to the Mount of Olives? The priest came out with the ark, and thankfully, David didn't take a page out of the sons of Eli's playbook and take it as a good luck charm. He says, no, we don't need that. Take that back. He said, because I understand if God wants me to win, he'll bring me back. And if he wants me to die, that's up to him, and I'm okay with it. Loose paraphrase. He was submitting to the sovereignty of God. He understood that God would determine the outcome of the story. But in that moment, he just didn't roll over. He made decisions. He didn't go to a cave somewhere and have a little pout. He didn't just sit back and on a rock and say, oh, I'm just going to let go and let God. Horrible theology. Do not get me started on that mess. David understood, I've got a job to do. God has called me to lead his people as the under shepherd. I have to make decisions, even though I made a lousy one 12 years ago and made a mess of things. God still wants to use me. He put me back on the A team. God never took him off the A team, to tell you the truth. Thousands of lives are at stake, and David understood that his decisions matter. And so even though David clearly stated a high view of the sovereignty of God, and he also understood that he has choices to make, and he had better do his part, which will facilitate God doing God's part, right? God's going to do his part regardless. Don't misunderstand my statement there. First thing he does is he learns that Ahithophel has betrayed him. Do you remember what he did a couple weeks ago? He prayed. What specifically did he pray? He prayed that God would use the counsel of Ahithophel to seem like foolishness. And then when we get to verse 14, we're told that that is exactly what happened. God answered David's prayer. David prayed. God answered. Clear statement, which leaves the question, what if David hadn't prayed? I have no idea. No idea. We can over-exercise the idea of the sovereignty of God, but you'll end up with a fatalistic view of life. Adult people who do not pray because they think no matter what I say or do, God's going to do what he's going to do anyway. And they either have the que sera, laissez-faire, we're kind of robots anyway, doesn't matter. And so they don't pray, even though God has commanded us, invited us, and moves with a prayer. You know, Revelation says God inhabits the praises of his people. Prayer is important, but it's a different sermon for another time. What we do, if David chooses to do nothing, this turns out differently. I don't believe Absalom would win because God is sovereign. But the text is clear, not only to tell us that David prayed, but it tells us exactly what he prayed for, and that is exactly what happened. Wow. Clearly, the intent of the text is David prays, God listens, God acted. How does the prayer of man move the hand of a sovereign God? I do not know, but it does. We'd be wrong to dismiss that from the text as if David's choice to pray and trust God doesn't matter. David prayed, God answered. It matters. So almost immediately after that, do you remember what David did? It was this little encounter with Hushai, his buddy. He's going up to the front side of the Mount of Olives, runs into his friend, and Hushai says, I want to go with you. And what does David do? He immediately makes a decision. It would be better for you to go back and pretend to be a counselor for Absalom, and then you can function as a spy for me. What happened? Absalom asked for a second opinion. Hushai gives him this horrible idea, and Absalom thinks that's a great idea. The text that we read this morning tells us that the plan is executed flawlessly, down to the detail. Why would it tell us all those details if it didn't matter? David's acting as a responsible leader, laying out a strategy, and it's executed perfectly, and it helps lead him to victory. It just reminds us both matter. God's going to do his part. He's faithful. But we have to do our part because we aren't always. Immediately when the spies leave, they come to this town of Bahurim. Hopefully that sounds a little bit familiar because in the previous chapter, that was the place where Shimei comes out and throws dirt and rocks at David and curses him. Remember that? And, this is the extended clan of Saul, the first king of Israel. The question is, why would Saul's extended family, at the risk of their own lives, create a place of safety and refuge for David's spies? Hit him in the well. The answer is because 2 decades earlier, David had shown great respect for Saul and Jonathan, his dear friend. When they died, he gives this wonderful tribute. He's overly compassionate to Saul and his family. He's generous and kind to Mephibosheth. And in the midst of that, he clearly endeared himself to Saul and the extended family. Now, 20 years later, in David's hour of need, those decisions mattered because they're taking care of his spies. But it's even more recent than that. 2 weeks ago, for us, when Shimei is yelling curses and throwing rocks, Abishai steps up and says, just give the word and I will cut the head off this dead dog. Had David had Abishai cut off Shimei's head, do you think that they would have hid his spies for him? That would have been new news. And I don't think they would have been as kind to David as they were. Not a big chance of that happening. But David heard the voice of God, even in the untrue things that Shimei was cursing him with. And it made it possible for the spies to be housed, find refuge, and eventually get to David. All these little choices mattered. Then we come to Mahanaim, that may or may not sound familiar. First thing we know, it was at the home of Shibbosheth. Shibbosheth was one of the sons of Saul, who was made king over the north by Abner. And he ruled there for several years, and then some mercenaries murdered him. Do you remember what happened? David was kind and respectful to Shibbosheth. When he was murdered, David went out of his way to distance himself from that behavior. He took the hands and the feet of the murderers and posted them on billboards saying, this isn't going to happen while I'm king. He did a tribute for Ishbosheth, maybe is the better way to say it. And then he buried him in a very respectful way and clearly endeared himself to these people in the town because of his response. Now, 2 decades later, that decision matters, right? 2 other names that are interesting in the last paragraph. One is Shobi, the son of Nahash. Why would the Ammonite king offer refuge and all this food to the Hebrew king? Go all the way back to the story. David entered into a peace agreement with Nahash. They respected one another, cared for one another. And in the midst, they shalomed. They had mutual peace with one another. And when Nahash died, David sent tribute. He sent sympathies. And he was sorry to hear about the death of the king. But the king's first son, Nahon, thought David was up to something. And that was the week that they cut off the robes and half the beards of David's men. And that did not go well. But now apparently that guy's dead, and Shobi's now the king of Ammon, and he remembers David's kindness to his dad 20 years ago. And he shows his appreciation by giving David and all the people safety, refuge, and incredible amounts of food. One last name is Mashir. Who's that guy? In the Mephibosheth story, when David wanted to do something for the family of Saul, he learns that there's a son of Jonathan who's crippled but still alive. Where does he live? He lives in Mahanaim. Who does he live with? I don't know, some dude named Mashir. This guy. Because he was crippled, he had no chance to survive. Mashir takes him in, takes care of him, so David pours out generosity on Mephibosheth, blesses him many times over, which endears him to the family of Machir. And now, all these years later, in David's hour of need, they're more than happy to return the favor by giving him shelter, refuge, and food, which, by the way, prepares them for next week's battle. All those little details and names are not insignificant. I have learned to read 2 Samuel so differently than I ever have in my life. It reminds us that the choices and decisions that David has made all along as king help define the story, which now brings us to our story. What was it where we started today? What is it that's heavy on your heart? Physical thing, relational thing, financial thing, spiritual thing. It's a sin thing. What's your part? And what's God's part? By faith, and that means confident commitment and acting as if it were already so, we can know God will do his part. The question is, will we do our part? There's only so much we can do. Probably can't change it, probably can't fix it totally, but we can be and do what we're supposed to be and do, and then trust God to do what we can't do. What we can do is limited, but the rest of it's in God's hands. And sometimes God takes his time, doesn't he? My least my least favorite place on earth is God's waiting room. I'm just being honest. I don't like waiting in the drive-through line. But God's waiting room, not good for me. Challenges my faith. And yet God does not operate on my timetable. I cannot book him into my schedule, right? He books me into his. But I can do my part and then trust God to be sovereign and do his part. He does have a plan and a purpose for my life and for yours. And he is up to something. But that thing that you listed, heavy on your heart, trust God to do his part because he will. But we have to commit to do our part. We need to realize our decisions matter. Our decisions shape the pathway of our life. And that's what we need to do. And so as the worship team comes up to do one last song, what is God asking you to do or be today that is your part? Because he will do his part. And those two things together will make up our story. When the song is over, if you'd like to be prayed with or prayed for, over here by the cross, our team will be there. All God's people said, thank you so much for your time today. Next week, our Pulse worship team will practice after the service.